There's something haunting about the glow of a fire in the dark, the way the flames dance, casting shadows that seem to whisper secrets of ages long past. If you're listening now, curled up somewhere cozy or drifting off to sleep, take a moment to let yourself sink into this quiet space. We'd love to know where you're joining us from tonight and what time your journey into rest begins. Let us know in the comments below, because every listener, every flicker of light in the darkness is part of this story. Picture it, a weary traveler wrapped in a cloak, sitting beside a crackling fire deep in the heart of an ancient forest. The air is thick with the scent of burning wood, and the only sound is the low, steady voice of the storyteller, weaving a tale so old it feels like the earth itself remembers. This is the story of the Balrogs, creatures of shadow and flame, born in the darkest corners of Middle-earth's history. They were not just monsters, they were forces of destruction, shaped by the very fires of the world's creation, and twisted into something terrifying. Their names alone were enough to chill the blood of the bravest warriors, their presence a omen of ruin. Tonight, we'll trace their footsteps through the ages, from the fiery depths where they first awoke to the battles that nearly shattered kingdoms. This isn't just a tale of monsters, it's a story of defiance, of light struggling against overwhelming darkness, of choices that echo across centuries. And as the firelight flickers, casting shapes that might just be more than shadows, you'll understand why these beings haunted the dreams of elves and men alike. So settle in, let the warmth of the flames push back the night, and listen closely. The history of the Balrogs is waiting to unfold. Long before the first sunrise painted the skies of Middle-earth, before the elves walked beneath the trees or men drew breath, something ancient slept in the deepest caverns of the world. These were not mere beasts, but horrors forged in the earliest days of creation, spirits of fire bound to shadow, shaped by Morgoth's will into his most terrible servants. They lay dormant for ages, coiled in the roots of mountains like embers waiting to be stoked. But then a sound, a ripple of music drifting down through stone, carried on the wind. The elves had awakened at last, their voices rising in songs so pure, so full of light, that the very earth trembled in answer, and deep below, something else stirred. A low growl echoed through the tunnels, a sound like cracking stone, then another and another. One by one, fiery eyes slit open in the dark, glowing like molten iron pulled from a forge. The Balrogs had not forgotten their master's call, the scent of the elves' joy, their unbroken light. It was a provocation, a spark thrown onto dry tinder. With a roar that shook the foundations of the world, they wrenched themselves free from the stone, their wings of smoke and flame unfurling as they climbed toward the surface. Where their claws touched the rock, it blackened and split. Where their breath passed, the air itself burned. This was no mindless awakening. The Balrogs remembered their purpose, to choke out light, to drown song and screams. And as they emerged into the world for the first time in millennia, the elves, innocent, radiant, had no idea what horrors they had unwittingly summoned. The first to see them did not live to tell the tale, but others would. For where the Balrogs walked, fire followed, and the earth bore their scars for ages to come. There was a time when Gondolin stood like a dream, carved in stone, white towers piercing the clouds, streets paved with jewels that caught the dawn light and scattered it into rainbows. Hidden deep in the encircling mountains, it was a refuge, a secret even Morgoth spies could not uncover. For centuries, the elves who dwelled there believed their city untouchable, a last flicker of light in a world growing ever darker. They built gardens where golden flowers never wilted, sang songs older than the hills, and told their children stories of the valor as if they were lullabies. But no wall, no matter how high, can keep out betrayal. It began with whispers. A discontented heart, poisoned by envy, began to murmur of the city's location to dark ears beyond the mountains. And when the traitor's words reached Morgoth, his laughter shook the foundations of Angband. At last, he could strike at the heart of his enemies. He would not send mere orcs, no. This demanded something far worse. From the deepest pits of his fortress, he unleashed his Balrogs, creatures that had not walked openly in Middle-earth for centuries. They came like a storm, their wings blotting out the sky, their fiery whips cracking like thunder. The first warning the people of Gondolin had was the sound of the mountains screaming. Stones split apart as the Balrogs forced their way through hidden passes, their claws tearing at the rock as if it were parchment. Then came the fire, great waves of it, rolling down the slopes, devouring the lush valleys that had once been Gondolin's pride. The elves fought bravely, their swords gleaming like stars against the darkness. But how could steel stand against creatures born of primordial flame? The Balrogs moved through the city like living wildfire, their very presence turning marble to ash, their laughter the roar of an inferno. Towers that had stood for ages crumbled in moments. Libraries filled with centuries of knowledge were reduced to smoke. The screams of the elves mingled with the crackling of flames, a chorus of despair that echoed even into the halls of the Valor. And at the center of it all stood Gothmog, Lord of Balrogs, his massive form wreathed in smoke, his whip coiled around the broken body of the king. That was the true horror of the Balrogs. They did not merely destroy. They took joy in it. They remembered the light of the world before Morgoth twisted them, and they hated it all the more for that memory. By dawn, Gondolin was no more. The few who escaped carried with them not just grief, but a lesson written in blood and fire. No sanctuary is eternal, and even the brightest light can be swallowed by shadow. The Balrogs had proven, once and for all, that they were not just weapons of war. They were the embodiment of ruin itself, and as the survivors fled into the wilds, they knew one terrible truth. This would not be the last time Middle-earth heard the Balrogs roar. Deep beneath the misty mountains, where the air was thick with the scent of stone and the echoes of countless pickaxes, the Dwarves of Khazad-dûm carved out a kingdom that glittered like the night sky. Their halls stretched for miles, adorned with pillars of polished marble and veins of mithril so pure it shone like captured starlight. For centuries, their wealth grew, their forges burned, and their songs filled the caverns, until the day their hammers struck too deep. No one could say which miner first heard it, the distant, rhythmic thud, like a great heartbeat pulsing from below. At first, they dismissed it as echoes of their own labor. But the sound grew louder, closer, until the walls themselves seemed to tremble in answer. Then came the heat. A dry, scorching wind began to rise from the deepest shafts, carrying with it the stench of sulfur and something older, something primal. The dwarves, ever stubborn, pressed on, their greed for mithril blinding them to the warnings written in the very rock around them. the first to die, did not even scream. One moment, a miner stood at the edge of a newly opened chasm, his lantern flickering against the darkness. The next, a whip of molten fire lashed upward, wrapping around his body like a serpent. The others barely had time to gasp before the creature pulled itself free from the abyss, a towering figure of shadow and flame, its wings spreading wide enough to blot out the torches lining the halls. Its eyes burned like twin furnaces, and when it roared, the sound was not just noise but a force, shaking loose stones from the ceiling, sending cracks racing up the walls like spiderwebs. This was Durin's Bane, a name whispered in dread long after the kingdom fell. The dwarves had not just disturbed a beast, they had woken a relic of an ancient war, a Balrog that had slumbered since the fall of Morgoth, waiting in the roots of the world. It moved through Khazad-dûm like a wild fire through dry grass, its very footsteps melting stone, its whip reducing armor to slag. The dwarves fought, yes. They were warriors, proud and fierce. But how do you strike at something that feeds on fire? How do you stand against a creature that remembers the shaping of the world? The survivors fled, their once glorious halls now a tomb, their songs replaced by the Balrogs' laughter, echoing through the darkness. And as the last gates of Khazad-dûm slammed shut behind them, sealed with spells and despair, they carried with them a bitter truth. Some shadows never fade. Some terrors, once awakened, cannot be put back to sleep. The Balrog did not follow them into the sunlight. It did not need to. It had claimed the depths for its own, and Middle-earth would never forget the price of greed, or the cost of digging too deep. The air in Moria was thick with dust, and the acrid stench of ancient stone as the Fellowship ran, their footsteps echoing through the hollowed-out bones of the Dwarven kingdom. Torchlight flickered wildly against the walls, casting jagged shadows that seemed to reach for them like grasping hands. Behind them, a sound grew, deep, resonant, like distant thunder rolling through the earth, except it was getting closer. Much closer. The ground trembled with each step the Balrog took, the tremors traveling up through their boots, into their bones, a relentless drumbeat of pursuit. Gandalf's voice cut through the panic, sharp as a blade. Do not stop, do not look back. But how could they not? The heat at their backs was unbearable, a furnace wind pushing them forward as if the very tunnels were exhaling in dread. Frodo's breath came in ragged gasps, the ring heavy around his neck, its weight nothing compared to the terror clawing at his throat. Beside him, Boromir's face was slick with sweat, his eyes darting to the crumbling arches above, as if calculating how long the ancient stone would hold. Then came the bridge, the slender span of Khazad-dûm, a fragile thread of stone arcing over the bottomless dark. It was their only path forward, their only chance. The Fellowship raced across, their footsteps ringing hollow against the narrow walkway, and then they felt it. The air itself seemed to ignite, a wave of heat so intense it stole the breath from their lungs. They turned because they had to, because some horrors demand to be seen. There, wreathed in smoke and flame, the Balrog loomed. Its wings, if they could be called wings, were vast sheets of shadow and fire, stretching wide enough to fill the cavern. Its eyes burned like dying suns, and when it roared, the sound was less a noise and more a force, a pressure that made the very stone beneath them shudder. Gandalf stood alone on the bridge, his staff raised, his voice booming with a power that didn't belong to mortals. "You shall not pass." For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. Then the bridge gave way, and the Balrog fell, but not without its vengeance. Its whip lashed out, coiled around Gandalf's ankle, and dragged him into the abyss. The last thing the Fellowship saw was the light of his staff, a single star swallowed by the dark, silence, then the sound of running water, distant and cold. The Fellowship stood frozen, the reality of what had happened crashing over them like a wave. They had escaped, but at what cost? The tunnels of Moria stretched on, endless and lightless, and though the Balrog was gone, its shadow lingered, in the trembling of their hands, in the hollows of their voices when they dared to speak again. Some nightmares don't end when you wake up. Some terrors follow you long after the fire has burned out. The moment hung suspended in time, a fragile breath between destruction and hope. Gandalf stood alone on the narrow span of the bridge, his robes whipping in the scorching wind that rose from the abyss below. The Balrog towered before him, a living tempest of flame and shadow, its very presence warping the air with heat, so intense it made the stone beneath their feet glow dull red. Yet in Gandalf's eyes, there was no fear, only a resolve as unyielding as the roots of the mountains. His staff blazed with a light that had no business existing in such darkness, a white fire that seemed to cut through the smoke like a blade. This was no ordinary duel of strength. It was a contest of ages, a collision of two powers that had shaped the fate of Middle-earth since its earliest days. The Balrog, a relic of Morgoth's reign, remembered the days when it had been a spirit of fire, pure and untamed, before darkness twisted its purpose. Gandalf, though cloaked in the guise of an old man, carried within him the authority of the Valar, a being not of this world, sent to stand against the creeping shadow. When he spoke, his voice was not his own. It echoed with the weight of centuries, of prophecies and battles long past. "You cannot pass," he thundered, and the words were not a challenge but a decree, as if the very laws of the world bent to his will. The Balrog hesitated. For the first time in millennia, something akin to doubt flickered in its burning eyes. It had faced armies, reduced kingdoms to ash, and laughed as the mightiest warriors fell before it. But this was different. The light of Gandalf's staff was not just brightness. It was a memory, a reminder of what the Balrog had once been before the corruption. And in that hesitation, Gandalf struck. He brought his staff down upon the bridge with a force that shattered stone. The ancient masonry groaned, then split apart with a sound like the world itself breaking. The Balrog lurched forward, its claws scrabbling at the crumbling edges, but it was too late. With a roar that shook the caverns, it fell, but not without one last act of malice. Its whip, molten and cruel, lashed out, coiling around Gandalf's leg with a searing grip. The wizard's cry was swallowed by the abyss as the darkness took them both. Silence followed, not the quiet of peace, but the stillness that comes after a storm, when the air itself seems to hold its breath. The Fellowship stood frozen, their hearts pounding in their chests, their eyes locked on the empty space where Gandalf had been. The bridge was gone, the Balrog was gone, but so was he. In that moment, they understood the true cost of their journey. This was not just a battle against shadows. It was a war of choices, of sacrifices, of light refusing to be extinguished even as it fell into the depths. And somewhere in the darkness below, a single spark still flickered. The silence that followed was heavier than the mountain itself. No one moved, no one spoke, even the echoes of their own breathing seemed to vanish into the cavernous dark. The Fellowship stood motionless on the far side of the broken bridge, their faces pale in the flickering remnants of torchlight, their eyes locked on the empty space where Gandalf had stood just moments before. Aragorn's hand hovered near his sword, not to draw it, but as if seeking something solid to anchor him to reality. Boromir's lips moved soundlessly, forming words too terrible to speak aloud. And Frodo felt the ring grow colder against his chest, as if it too understood what had been lost. Above them, the cavern groaned, its ancient stones shifting under the weight of what had just transpired. Dust rained down like a slow, sorrowful snowfall, settling on their shoulders like the ashes of a funeral pyre. The Balrog was gone. Gandalf was gone. And with them, something else, something none of them could name, but all of them felt. The certainty that had carried them this far, the unspoken trust that Gandalf would always find a way. It had fallen into the abyss with him. Legolas was the first to break the spell. His voice, usually so light, was rough with something no elf should ever know. "We cannot stay here." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a truth too vast to ignore. The mines of Moria were no longer just dark, they were hungry, and the Fellowship, now smaller by one, was no longer just fleeing orcs or shadows. They were running from a grief too fresh to name, a loss too enormous to face. Aragorn nodded, his jaw tightening as he forced himself to turn away from the chasm. "We go on," he said, and the words were not just a command but a vow. For Gandalf, for all of them, but as they stumbled forward, their footsteps hollow against the stone, none of them dared to look back. Not at the bridge. Not at the darkness where the fire had been, because some falls are not just into shadow, they are into legend, and legends, once begun, do not end quietly. The fire may have faded from sight, but in the heart of the mountain, embers still smoldered. Whispers slithered through the halls of Moria long after the Fellowship fled, hushed tales of a shadow that refused to die. Deep beneath the shattered bridge, where no light dared to linger, the Balrog stirred. Its wounds, though grievous, were not mortal. The earth itself seemed to nurse its burns, the heat of its body seeping into the stone like a fevered dream. Time meant nothing to such a creature. It could wait. It had waited before, and while it healed, something else happened. A tremor, faint but unmistakable, rippled through the roots of the mountains. Far to the north, in the ruins of Ang, and where Morgoth once ruled, the ground trembled as if answering a call. Ancient tunnels, long collapsed, shifted like the ribs of a waking beast. Those who listened closely, fools brave enough to press their ears to the blackened rock, claimed they heard it, a low, rhythmic pulse, as if the mountain itself had a heartbeat. The traveler's voice drops to a hush now, the firelight painting their face in flickering gold and shadow. Where one Balrog falls, they murmur, others remember. Because these creatures were never truly alone. They were a brotherhood of flame, bound by the same dark master, and though Morgoth was gone, his will lingered in their blood like poison. Some whispered that Durin's Bane had been the last of its kind. Others knew better. In forgotten corners of the world, buried under ice, locked in volcanic tombs, or drowned in sunless seas, other Balrogs slept. Not dead, never dead, only waiting, and if one could rise, What was to stop the rest? The traveler leans closer, the fire casting their shadow tall and twisting against the cave wall. The earth never forgets, they say, and neither do the things that live in it. There are things in the dark that even the Balrogs do not command, creatures older than malice, hungrier than fire. As the traveler's voice drops to a whisper, the firelight gutters low, as if afraid to cast its glow too far. The watcher in the water, they say, was no mere beast. It did not serve Morgoth, nor did it care for the wars of elves or men. It was something else entirely, a thing that had crept into the world's cracks long before the first Dark Lord rose, waiting with the patience of stone. The pools outside Moria's gates had always been still, black as polished obsidian, their surfaces unbroken by ripple or reflection. The dwarves, in their pride, had carved their great doors to overlook those waters, never questioning why no fish swam there, why no bird dared to drink. They did not notice the way the water never froze, even in the bitterest winters, or how sometimes, on moonless nights, something beneath the surface would shift. The watcher did not hunt, it did not stalk, it simply existed, a presence so ancient it had forgotten its own name until the day the Fellowship came. When Frodo's foot disturbed the water's edge, it was not just a ripple that answered. The pool erupted, tentacles thicker than tree trunks lashing upward, their slick surfaces studded with suckers that left burns where they touched. The creature moved with a speed that defied its size, its limbs coiling around stone, bending iron like wet clay, and its eyes, when they breached the surface, glowing with a sickly green light. The Fellowship saw the truth. This was no animal defending its territory. This was a thing that remembered when the mountains were young, when the world was still soft and shapeless. It did not hate them, it barely noticed them at all, and that was the true horror. The Balrogs were destruction given form, but the Watcher was indifference. It would crush them not out of malice, but because they were there, because its limbs could reach them, because the water was cold and their blood was warm. As the Fellowship scrambled through the crumbling doors, the last thing they heard was the sound of the Watcher settling back into its pool, the water closing over it like a lid on a tomb. But here's the thought that lingers, the one that keeps the traveler's listeners awake long after the fire burns low. If the Watcher was but a shadow, a mere appendage of something greater, what then still sleeps beneath the roots of the world? What stirs when the earth shudders, not in anger, but in its dreaming? The Balrogs were horrors enough, but the dark is vast, and not all its children wear flames. Long before the great cities of elves and men rose from the earth, before the sun and moon took their places in the sky, Morgoth's legions stretched across the land like a creeping shadow. Among them marched the Balrogs, not merely scattered terrors, but a host of flame and fury, their numbers vast enough to darken the horizon. In those days, they did not lurk in forgotten depths or slumber beneath mountains. They stood as generals of ruin, their names spoken in dread from the highest peaks to the deepest valleys. Time has erased most of those names, but the scars they left remain. Take the Battle of Sudden Flame, where Morgoth's forces erupted from Ambience like a storm of burning pitch. The Balrogs led the charge, their whips carving rivers of fire through the ranks of the elves. Entire forests became pyres that night, the smoke so thick it blotted out the stars. The earth split open beneath the feet of the advancing horde, and from the cracks rose waves of Balrogs, their wings casting jagged shadows across the slaughter. They moved not as mindless beasts, but as a disciplined force, herding the elves into traps, cutting off retreats with walls of flame. The greatest of them, Gothmog, was more than a brute. He was a tactician of terror, his very presence bending the battlefield to his will. Yet even in that age of unrelenting darkness, there were moments when light struck back. The Fall of Gondolin was not just a tale of destruction, but of defiance. The Elven King Turgon, though he knew his city was doomed, ordered his people to fight to the last, and fight they did. Balrogs met their end that day, not at the hands of armies, but by the courage of single warriors. Thalian of the Fountain, his armor shattered, his body broken, still found the strength to drag Gothmog into the depths of the city's gleaming waters. The Lord of Balrogs, who had laughed at the deaths of thousands, drowned like a common beast, his flames extinguished by the very element he despised. And then there was Glorfindel, whose golden hair shone like a beacon amid the smoke. When a Balrog ambushed the fleeing survivors at the pass of Cirith Thornath, he stood alone against it. Their duel shook the cliffs, sending boulders crashing into the abyss below. In the end, both fell, but Glorfindel's sacrifice bought the others time to escape, and his name was sung for ages after. These were not victories in the grand sense. Gondolin still fell. The Balrogs still marched, but they were reminders that even the darkest shadows could be pierced, if only for a moment. The traveler pauses, stirring the embers with a stick. The firelight dances in their eyes as they speak the last, chilling truth. The Balrogs of the elder days were not just stronger, not just fiercer, they were smarter. They remembered the world before Morgoth's corruption, and that memory made them hate all the more. They did not merely destroy, they took joy in unmaking, in reducing beauty to ash, in proving that no light could endure forever. And though their numbers dwindled over the ages, though they vanished into the deep places of the world, one question lingers like smoke in the air. If even a handful could bring kingdoms to their knees, what horrors might awaken if they ever rose again as one? The fire crackles low now, its glow reduced to embers that pulse faintly in the dark like drowsy eyes. The traveler wraps their cloak tighter, their voice barely above a whisper. Durin's Bane was not the first to wake, and it may not be the last. The words hang in the air, heavy with implication. Across Middle-earth, in the places where the earth is oldest and the shadows thickest, the ground remembers. It remembers the weight of fiery footsteps, the echo of wings stirring in the deep. Some say the Balrogs dwindled over the ages, their numbers whittled away by war and time. Others argue they merely retreated, burrowing deeper into the world's bones, biding their time like smoldering coals beneath ash. The mines of Moria were not the only kingdom to dig too greedily, too deep. Far to the east, in the volcanic wastes of Mordor, the earth trembles with a heat that has nothing to do with Sauron's forges. The dwarves of the Orocarni whisper of chambers, where the air shimmers with invisible flame, where the rock itself sometimes groans as if something vast turns in its sleep. And then there are the rumors from the Iron Hills, tales of miners vanishing without a sound, their picks left embedded in walls streaked with veins of blackened stone, as if the rock had briefly melted. No bodies are ever found, only the scent of sulfur lingering like a warning. The traveler leans forward, the firelight carving shadows into their face. Creatures like the Balrogs do not simply vanish. They are forces of nature, as eternal as the fire that birthed them. And fire, they murmur, only ever does one of two things. It burns or it waits. The silence that follows is not empty. It is the silence of held breath, of a world straining to hear the first distant crackle of flame. Perhaps Durin's Bane was the last, perhaps, but in the dark, beneath the weight of centuries, who is to say something else does not dream of waking? History is littered with the ashes of fools who believed fire could be tamed. The traveler's voice grows quieter now, as if sharing a secret too dangerous to speak aloud. Long after the great battles faded into legend, there were those who whispered of the Balrogs not as enemies, but as tools, weapons, waiting to be wielded by hands bold enough to grasp them. Sorcerers, their eyes alight with ambition, descended into the deepest chasms where the earth still remembered the touch of molten claws. They carried charms etched in tongues dead for millennia, spells meant to bind flame to their will. They believed themselves different. They were wrong. The first to try was a man of Numenor, his bloodline stretching back to the kings of old. He found the cave where Durin's Bane had once crawled forth, its walls still warm to the touch, the air thick with the scent of scorched stone. For 7 nights, he chanted words that made the rocks tremble, his voice growing hoarse with desperation. On the 8th night, something answered, not the Balrog itself, but its echo, a fragment of its fury left behind like a spark in dry tinder. The sorcerer's triumph turned to screams as the flames that leaped from the walls did not obey his commands. They slithered up his arms like serpents, his spells unraveling as the fire tasted his flesh. By dawn, only his staff remained, its iron head melted into a shape that vaguely resembled a hand, still reaching. Others followed, each convinced they had learned from the mistakes of the past. A witch queen of Rune sought to carve the Balrog's name into her own skin, thinking its power would flow through her veins. She did not understand that these creatures were not mere demons to be summoned. They were forces of nature, older than language, older than pain. When the ritual failed, her followers found her kneeling before a blackened fissure, her body untouched, her eyes hollowed into smoking pits. She was still whispering when they dragged her away, her voice repeating the same phrase in a tongue no living soul could comprehend. Even Sauron, in all his cunning, never dared to command a Balrog. He knew what the sorcerers did not. Fire cannot be enslaved. It can only be fed. The traveler leans closer now, the firelight carving shadows into their face. That is the lesson written in every scorched bone, every melted crown. The Balrogs were never beasts to be broken or spirits to be bargained with. They were wildfires given form, and wildfires do not distinguish between those who light them and those who stand too close. The embers pulse softly, as if in agreement. Some prices are not paid in gold or blood, but in the terrible moment when ambition meets the truth. There are powers in this world that do not bend. They only burn. There are places in Middle-earth where the wind carries more than just the scent of pine or rain, where the air itself seems to hum with something older, darker. The traveler's voice drops to a hush now, their words curling like smoke in the dimming firelight. The Balrogs may have fallen, they murmur, but shadows never truly leave. In the deepest caverns, along the crumbling edges of forgotten battlefields, even in the quiet corners of bustling cities, their influence lingers like the smell of char after a fire has died. It seeps into stone, into dreams, into the hearts of those who listen too closely. Take the ruins of a region where the elves once forged their greatest rings. The land there is still fair, the grass green, the rivers clear, but those who walk its empty streets at dusk speak of a pressure in the air, a whisper just beyond hearing. Some claim it's the echo of Celebrimber's lament. Others know better. The Balrogs who raised a region did not merely destroy its towers, they poisoned its memory. To stand among those broken stones is to feel the weight of eyes upon you, though nothing moves in the twilight. Then there are the mines of Nogrod, long abandoned by dwarves. The veins of gold there still gleam, untouched by pick or axe, because the miners who dared to return spoke of noises in the dark, not the skittering of orcs or the drip of water, but something deeper. A sound like embers cracking, or laughter muffled by stone. They fled before they could learn more, but the tales followed them. Tools left behind were found days later, warped as if by terrible heat, though no flame had been lit. And perhaps most chilling of all are the stories from the east, where the lands grow wild and the names of ancient evils still cling to the earth like rot. Nomads who cross the plains of Rune avoid certain valleys where the ground is blackened in patterns too precise to be natural. They say if you camp there, you'll wake to find your fire burning too bright, too blue, though you added no fresh wood. And if you're foolish enough to speak to the flames, well, the nomads don't speak of what answers. They simply tie a red cord around their wrists and move on before sunset. The traveler's fingers tighten around their cloak. Malice doesn't fade, they say. It waits, it whispers, and in the hush that follows, the fire pops suddenly, sending up a spiral of sparks, as if something somewhere has stirred in its sleep. Men have always been drawn to the dark places of the world, driven by a hunger. No feast can satisfy the hunger to know what lies beneath. The traveler's voice drops low, their fingers tracing the edge of their cloak, as if feeling the weight of centuries. They dig, they whisper, they always dig, and with every tunnel carved, every mountain gutted, they edge closer to things older than their names, older than their gods. It began with the dwarves, yes, but men learned greed just as swiftly. In the east, where the earth is rich with veins of gold and secrets, kingdoms rose atop mines, so deep the bottom was never found. The miners spoke of whispers in the dark, of tools gone missing, of warm drafts rising from places where no fire burned. Their lords dismissed them as superstition, as the mutterings of tired minds. Until the day the earth coughed up its wrath, the city of Zurak was the first to fall, a jewel of men. Its towers kissed the clouds, its markets overflowed with treasures pried from the belly of the world. Then came the tremors, not the slow groan of settling stone, but something sharper, something alive. The miners fled first, their faces streaked with soot and terror, babbling of cracks in the tunnels that pulsed like open wounds. By the time the nobles ordered the gates sealed, it was too late. The streets split open, not with lava or water, but with shadows that moved against the wind. And from those shadows, shapes emerged. Not Balrogs, no, these were something leaner, hungrier, their bodies woven from the dark between stars. They did not burn. They devoured. By dawn, Zurak was a tomb. Not a single scream had escaped its walls. The only sign of struggle was the gold, left untouched in the streets, as if whatever took the people had no use for mortal treasures. The traveler leans closer, the fire casting their shadow high against the cave wall. Men call it greed, they say, but the earth calls it reckoning. For every kingdom that digs too deep, there is a price, and the Balrogs, they are but the first note in a chorus of terrors. The deeper men delve, the older the nightmares they wake. Some say the dark is empty. They are wrong. The dark is patient, and it remembers every name. The fire has burned low now, its light barely enough to push back the gathering dark. The traveler's voice is softer, edged with something heavier than warning, something closer to sorrow. There are stories, they murmur, that should never be told aloud. Not because they aren't true, but because they are. The embers pulse faintly, as if in agreement. For every tale of treasure hidden in the deep places of the world, there are a dozen more of doors sealed for a reason. The Dwarves of Khazad-dûm learned that lesson in blood and flame. The miners of Zurak never learned it at all, and yet still, the call of the unknown whispers in the hearts of kings and fools alike. What waits beneath the mountain? What glitters in the untouched dark? The traveler's fingers tighten around their knees. Curiosity is a flame, they say. And flame has a way of spreading. But here is the truth the old songs don't sing. Some things sleep because they must. The Balrogs were not merely beasts to be slain or avoided. They were warnings carved into the bones of the earth. Every broken kingdom, every melted crown, every echo of laughter from the deep was a message. There are lines even the brave should not cross. The traveler leans forward, their face half lost in shadow. We tell ourselves we dig for gold, for glory, for answers, but the dark doesn't care why we come. It only cares that we do, and perhaps that's the most terrible lesson of all. The Balrogs were never the true horror. They were merely the consequence. The real monster was the hand that kept turning the page, the foot that kept stepping forward, the voice that said, just a little deeper. The fire gutters, and for a heartbeat, the darkness feels less like absence, and more like a presence, a held breath, a gathering storm. The traveler doesn't say goodbye. They don't need to. The silence speaks for them, heavy with the weight of all the doors left unopened, all the chasms left uncharted. Some legends are better left undisturbed. Some fires should never be fed, and as the last ember winks out, the dark feels less like an ending and more like a mercy. The silence stretches, thick and suffocating, the way air holds still just before a storm breaks. The traveler doesn't move, doesn't blink, their gaze fixed on the dying embers as if reading some final message in the fading glow. The listeners dare not speak, afraid to disturb the quiet, afraid of what might answer if they do. Even the wind hesitates, its usual murmur gone silent, as though the world itself is holding its breath. This is the silence of aftermath, not the calm after a storm, but the hush of a battlefield when the last sword has fallen, when the only sound left is the slow drip of blood on stone. The tale of the Balrogs is not just a story of monsters. It's a mirror held up to the darkest corners of the world, and to the parts of ourselves that wonder what we'd risk for power, for knowledge, for a glimpse into the abyss. The traveler knows this. That's why they let the quiet linger, let it press against the listener's ribs like a weight. Some truths don't need words to be felt. Outside the circle of firelight, the darkness seems to shift, not with movement, but with presence, as if something out there in the night has been listening all along. The listeners stiffen, their hands curling into fists or clutching at cloaks, though none will admit to the chill slithering down their spines. The traveler's lips twitch not a smile, but something older, sadder. They've seen this reaction before. It's the same in every age, in every tongue. The moment a story stops being just a story and becomes a warning, a log collapses in the fire with a soft crack, sending up a shower of sparks that dance like fleeing spirits. The sound jolts the listeners, their breath returning in shallow gasps, as if they'd forgotten to breathe. The traveler finally stirs, leaning back against the rock behind them, their voice a dry whisper. You feel it now, don't you? They don't wait for an answer. That's the weight of history, not in books or songs, but in the spaces between, in the quiet. And then, softer still, almost lost beneath the sigh of the wind, finally returning. The Balrogs are gone, but the dark they walked in, that's always there. Waiting, the words hang, heavy as a blade balanced on a thread. No one asks what it's waiting for. Some questions are better left unanswered. The fire flares suddenly, its light licking the walls of the cave like a starving thing, casting the traveler's face in jagged shadows. Their voice, which had been a murmur moments ago, now rises with the flames sharp, urgent, as if the story itself is clawing its way out of them. There was one, they say, just one, who looked into the eyes of a Balrog and did not blink. The words hang in the air like smoke, swirling with something darker than mere tale. They call him Thalian of the Broken Sword, though that was not his name when he first descended into the dark. He was a warrior of the Edain, his blade forged by elven hands, his heart unburdened by the weight of dread. When the whispers came of a creature stirring beneath the Erd Gorgoroth, he did not hesitate. Men said it was courage. The elves, wiser in such things, called it hubris. What Thalian found in the depths was no sleeping beast. The Balrog awaited him, not as a predator lies in wait, but as a storm waits inevitable, indifferent. Their battle was not the clash of armies, not the grand duel of legends. It was a man, small and desperate, swinging a sword that shattered against hide forged in the fires of creation. The Balrog did not strike him down, it simply looked at him, and in that gaze, Thalian saw the truth. The traveler's voice drops to a whisper. It showed him the void. Not death, not an end, but the absence that came before the world and will remain after. The dark that even flame cannot pierce. Thalian's sword fell from fingers gone numb. He did not run. He did not scream. When the Balrog turned away, leaving him unharmed, it was not mercy. It was disinterest. They found Thalian days later, stumbling from the mountains, his hair turned white, his eyes empty as polished stone. He never spoke again, not of the Balrog, not of anything. But sometimes, on nights when the wind howled just so, those who dared to listen heard him humming a tune, a melody no mortal tongue had ever sung, a song that made the hearthfire gutter and the shadows twist. The traveler leans back, the firelight dimming as if drained by the telling. That is the true power of the Balrogs. They murmur, not the fire, not the fury, but the knowing. To see them is to see the edge of the world, where all light fails. The embers pulse once, twice, like a dying heartbeat, and no one who peers over that edge ever comes back whole. The embers glow faintly now, their light barely enough to reveal the faces gathered around them. The traveler leans back, their cloak pooling like spilled ink against the stone, and lets the silence stretch not the heavy quiet of fear, but the soft hush that follows a story well told. Remember this, they murmur, their voice weaving through the dark like smoke. The Balrogs were terrible, yes, but they were never the whole story. Middle-earth is vast, its history written not just in fire and shadow, but in starlight on water, in the rustle of leaves in Lothlorien, in the laughter of hobbits gathered around a kitchen table. For every Balrog that ever climbed from the depths, there were 100 acts of courage, small, quiet, unremembered by songs. A farmer sharing bread with a starving stranger. A child hiding a wounded bird from the storm. A single candle lit in a window, defiant against the night. The traveler's fingers trace the edge of their empty cup, their gaze distant. Darkness has its champions, they admit, but so does the light, and light doesn't always come with a sword. It's in the hands that rebuild after the fire, in the voices that keep singing when the world grows cold, in the choices ordinary, unremarkable choices, to be kind when cruelty would be easier. The Balrogs were forces of destruction, but they never understood the stubbornness of hope. A breath of wind stirs the ashes, sending up a last spiral of sparks. Somewhere far above, beyond the cave's mouth, the stars turn in their ancient courses. The night is deep, but it is not endless. Dawn always comes, and when it does, the traveler knows it will find the world still here. A bruised, yes, but unbroken. The listeners exhale, their shoulders loosening. The tale is done, but its weight lingers, not as a burden, but as a reminder. Fear is real, but so is courage. And in the balance between them, that's where stories are born. The fire flickers once more, then fades, leaving only the scent of pine and the quiet certainty that morning is on its way.